Hey, what's up YouTube? This is tcgsam here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about where to hand trap for the Justice Hunters format. I'll be going over some of the key cards in each of the new decks that you need to know about, and some key interactions, as well as the hand traps that work the best against these decks. But with all that being said, let's hop straight into it. So there are a few cards I think we should go over for the K9 strategy, the first one being JUSH. JUSH is kind of what allows the K9 strategy to really act as a powerful extender engine in any deck that has level 5s. You're able to special summon itself and any other level 5 from the deck. It's pretty hard to actually stop JUSH from coming out onto the board, so if your opponent resolves JUSH and summons out a level 5 from like the K9 engine or their own engine, it's generally going to be pretty hard to stop. So I think you kind of want to focus on like stopping your opponent from getting access to JUSH because of how fast like JUSH and a level 5 snowballs. Another key level 5 that you want to look out for is Lantern. Lantern sort of just gets them a free rank 5 once you have a K9 in the graveyard, and it also adds a K9 spell once per turn on the field. So these are very, very powerful extenders in the K9 deck and are used a lot throughout the K9 combos because they all sort of access each other. Something important to note with JUSH and Lantern is that if they use their own effects to special summon, you actually can't use like those bodies for a light HTs monster. That's important for a card like Paradise Smasher, meaning your opponent should only be able to Paradise Smasher you if they use Azuna. Speaking of Azuna is like the built-in hand trap of the deck, and something you need to watch out for when playing against any K9 strategy. If you activate a card in hand or graveyard during this turn, they can special summon out Azuna, dump Lupus can bring itself out, and can quick effect XYZ summon during the opponent's turn. This can go into cards like Nash Knight to steal a monster, this can go into cards like Valon to book a monster, so a very, very powerful hand trap, and also a very, very powerful extender if you do hand trap the K9 decks. Even though this is a video about where to hand trap, K9 is special in the sense that like you almost don't want to hand trap it because you don't want to give cards like Azuna extra value. And then the in-engine rank 5 that everyone goes for is Ripper. Ripper allows them to grab access to engine through its own effect, but also protects them from further hand traps like Nibiru. Not to mention, Ripper also pairs really well with their quick play rank, essentially like their rank up spell card, X First Release, which allows them to special summon out a K9 Werewolf rank 9 on top of the Ripper, and then allows them to pop a card off of Release. Ripper, Release, and Azuna are kind of like the disruptions of the deck, and then JUSH and Lantern are sort of like the enablers that sort of get the engine rolling. So in terms of like what cards to stop, like cards like Imperm should be pretty good on Ripper, assuming they don't have Lupus under it. And stopping them from getting access to the quick play spell can also be pretty solid as well, because quick play spell is like 2 forms of interaction on its own. Although I will say like this is probably the deck that feels the worst to hand trap because of how much extra value their cards get after getting hit with a hand trap. So do keep that in mind when playing against this. There are still a few hand traps I think are worth talking about against K9 though. You'll notice that I put all like the trap hand traps except for songs and must play. I think that's because like they just don't trigger the K9 effects, and that's something that's super important. Like you don't give your opponent value off their Azuna, you don't give them bonus value off of their Ripper. So I feel like all the trap hand traps are some of the best hand traps that feel safe to use against K9. Outside of those though, I think there are a few that are like decent. I think both Fula and Perulia can be pretty solid, can really restrict like the end board that they try to make. Although I will caveat with saying like if you do hit them with these monster hand traps, your opponent will likely go for a Paradise Smasher route, and then Paradise Smasher will essentially just turn skip you. So that's something to keep in mind, which when playing against K9, I think a lot of people prefer board breakers just so they don't play into like Paradise Smasher specifically. But if you are playing hand traps, like these are still fine against like the K9 deck. Azuna itself is also really good against K9 because they do need to activate stuff in the hand. Outside of that though, I think the only other cards that are really worth talking about are like cards like Ogre, Bell, and DD Crow. The reason these are even like okay against the deck are because of how they interact with a card like Lupus. If your opponent uses K9 Azuna and dumps Lupus, and then Lupus comes out into the field, you can hit it with like Crow or Bell before it leaves the graveyard, or like Ogre it on the field to like get rid of the body forever as well, which is really powerful. This small interaction makes it so like Crow, Ogre, and Bell are like hand traps that could have some potential. Just stopping the extra rank 5 from Lupus can be, and taking away some follow-up can be pretty important. But overall, like I think hand traps are generally like not really recommended against the K9 engine itself. But if you do have hand traps in your deck anyways, at least now you'll know which ones are like okay against K9 at least. Next up for the new decks, we have Yummy. Starting off with like their level 1 main deck monsters, Cupsy is the one that allows them to add their spells and from their deck to their hand, so they'll add a card like Surprise, which we'll talk more about later. But Cupsy is kind of like the most important, I think, main deck Yummy monster because it lets them make their end board much more layered. Being able to search Surprise means they essentially get many extra forms of interaction, even if their main monster zone gets like outed. Other small monsters are also pretty like solid as well. Cards like Cookie contribute to like the interruptions that the end board has, allowing them to like pop a monster when it's reborn by a synchro effect. I think perhaps more like interestingly though are like the spell cards in the Yummy deck. Like I talked about with Cupsy, Surprise is kind of like the card that allows them to have a layered end board. They're able to either bounce like 2 cards on the field, or they're able to special summon like back a Yummy from the graveyard, and that one Yummy can kind of like snowball into like many more Yummies. So if you are playing a board breaker strategy, I think a very viable strategy is just to cut off Cupsy from being able to add Yummy Surprise, and then just hit them with a board breaker that like deals with all their monsters on the field like a Dark Ruler. I think that sort of pairing can be pretty potent. But also something that's important to note against this deck is their minion field spell is kind of like almost like the most important card of the deck. It seems kind of unassuming when you look at it, just being like a reborn, giving all their monsters 500 attack. But something important to note against this deck is not all their monsters are incredibly tiny. Without the minion field spell, like they actually just can't beat over anything that's like higher than I think like 1600. So if you are able to like permanently remove minion with a card like SP Little Knight or like DD Crow once into the graveyard, that actually is a pretty viable win condition against the Yummy deck. So, and I think that that's something you actually want to go for. Like, even if you aren't able to break their full board, if you just are able to out the minion, then it can be really difficult for the Yummy opponent to really come back from there and beat you because their monsters are just so tiny. And then for the extra deck Yummy monsters, the main one you want to know about is Snatchy. Snatchy on summon just like places one of the field spells and then allows them to quick synchro during either player's main phase or battle phase. This helps them like dodge cards like hand traps, gives them interactions on your turn. It sort of does everything for the deck. So even though it's like really hard to like stop Snatchy, a way to like quote unquote deal with it is like maybe just like hit it on summon with a card like Ogre or Imperm. If they have no other level 1s on the field, they can't like quick effect synchro, then it can be pretty good in those cases to just remove it off the board right away. Their synchros are also some of the hardest monsters to deal with, because every time you activate a card or effect, they can tag out into like 2 more Yummies in the graveyard. It's pretty hard to like hit the synchros with anything other than a card like Bell maybe, but it's important to know that the synchros will keep tagging into Snatchy, Snatchy will keep synchroing away itself in the level 1s into more synchros, and then they'll kind of repeat that process again and again throughout both players' turns in order to set up their interactions. So that's generally like the gist of Yummy. It is also kind of hard to hand trap this deck because they have so many extenders and their cards just inherently play through hand traps so well. Some hand traps that can be pretty good against Yummy are like the ones I have on this list here. I think the best one is probably Fulos. Fulos of course can like really cap their end board turn 1, but even as a 6th draw, Fulos is actually a pretty good card because it means like every time they try to quick synchro with Snatchy on your turn, you're able to just like plus off it every single time. Outside of like Fulos though, like and like the usual like must play contenders like Impulse and Shifter, it just feels like most hand traps are only like meh against Yummy. I think Ogres may be something with a little bit more potential because in theory, like I said, if you Ogre like the Snatchy Link one and they don't have an extender, it can completely turn skip them. And I think for that reason, Ogre's like one of the few low impact hand traps that actually have like some decent usage against Yummy, I think. Charmy like Perulia and Meowls can be okay, but I feel like Yummy hands, like unless they're very specifically weak to like these cards, should just be able to play through them without giving you many draws at all. Phantasma is also something that's like potentially worth considering because they do summon Snatchy a lot, and then you are able to protect yourself from like their targeting effects like Cookie, which can be pretty solid. I think that's something that warrants more testing. And like I mentioned, Bell can be pretty good at stopping the synchros from taking out. Something else that's like kind of cool against Yummy is like Contact C. I think this is a card that with some potential against Yummy, depending on how much your opponent chooses to like how much your Yummy opponent chooses to respect this card in their deck building. If they don't respect it, it can be a huge blow up, but if they respect it and put the right cards in their extra deck, this card just is not going to be that good. And speaking of cards that are not good, something like the only unplayable card that I think is like worth talking about is like K9 Azuna. Like none of the Yummy effects like activate in hand or graveyard, so K9 Azuna as a hand trap should just never be live against this deck. Something to keep in mind if you're playing like a K9 strategy, Azuna is rarely ever going to be live against Yummy unless they specifically hand trap you. And then for the last of the new Justice Hunters decks, we have Dracotail. Whenever I talk about fusion-based strategies, I think you always want to cut off their like fusion outlets. These fusion decks like don't really do anything if they don't have access to like fusing away their monsters for their fusion monsters. They have like 3 fusion outlets in the deck at the moment. They have Femina, which is like a hand trap fusion that allows them to fuse during the main phase. They have Malulu, which is like their normal summon and allows them to like fuse as well, and then Rahu Dracotail, which is kind of like a pseudo branded fusion. I think being able to stop them from getting access to these cards can be pretty important, and stopping their effects from resolving, like I said, against the fusion deck is almost like a death sentence because all their monsters only get real effects once they're fused off essentially. Femina is something to watch out for because it does give them an in-engine hand trap to play on your turn 0, so that's something to keep in mind. They can go into a card like Altharion, which is one of their boss monsters that allows them to bounce monsters from the field or graveyard, which can be really good at allowing them to like bounce resources back to their hand or even out cards on your field. And I know it's a little bit out of order, but also the other fusion monster I think is worth talking about right now since we're on the topic of like the Dracotail fusions. Gulamel's effect is is kind of like Thunder Drake and Titan in the sense that whenever they activate a Dracotail effect, if like no one has any response, they can chain Gulamel to pop a card. So the way you can kind of play around this is like just make sure you chain something to like a Dracotail effect whenever they have Gulamel on the field. It doesn't matter what it is, it just needs to be like in response to a Dracotail card, because Gulamel needs to directly respond to the card itself for you to get the effect. So that's kind of a neat way to play around Dracotail. Another sort of neat thing to know is like against the traps, I'm sure most people know like they can be ashed, they can be belled, because they do include the effect to put back a card and draw. But something cool against like Dracotail Horn, like a way you can constantly play around it is just summon your guys in defense mode. It seems really obvious like once you read the card. If your deck has the capability of summoning monsters in defense mode, like there should be no reason you really need to play into Dracotail Horn until you've already established enough of your board. And since this deck is so low to the ground, it feels like every single one of their interruptions is like a key part of their end board. Like they need those interruptions to be live for their end board to really be able to stop any of the best decks, in my opinion. So just something to keep in mind when playing against like the Dracotail Horn specifically. And then as for hand traps that are good against Dracotail, I think it's slightly easier to hand trap this deck than like the other decks, but it's also important to note that like since this deck is so low to the ground at the moment, there actually aren't that many hand traps that feel super high impact against it. Like we have the usual suspects like Impulse and Shifter that are good. Izuna's particularly good because this deck always has to use monster effects in the hand or graveyard to like get their engine rolling. And then cards I think are solid. Bell, like I mentioned, it has applications at stopping cards like Altharion. It has applications against stopping their trap cards from resolving. Cards like Imperm and Veiler are also in that category. Like just being able to stop Altharion from grabbing resources back to the hand can be pretty important. And also a card like Delta, which normally isn't that good against other decks, can be better because they do have more like powerful spell cards like Rahu, Dragontail that you want. Something important to note though is like the Charmies just aren't really good against this deck. Like I mentioned, this deck is very, very low to the ground. Like no matter which Charmy you use against them, like at most you're getting like one draw probably, maybe two off of a card like Fulos. But for that reason, I think that like the Charmies are just not that good against Dracotail. And something important to note as well is like Droll has not been very good against any of the new Justice Hunters deck. So I think that if you are choosing to play Droll like in your deck, you might want to consider putting it into your side deck just because of how poor it performs into like some of these new decks out here. But outside of that, I think like there isn't really too much more to say about the Dracotail deck. It can be kind of hard. Like most hand traps are not great against Dracotail because of its inherent game plan, but there are a few hand traps with like Bell that have like neat interactions that I think you should know about. Alright, so getting into the decks like that aren't part of Justice Hunters but are still relevant to the format, I think the first one I want to talk about is Vanquish Soul. I did cover Vanquish Soul in like a previous video, so I'm going to kind of skim over it more in this video, but their main card is still Raisin. They want to get access to Raisin cycling every single turn. Not only does it grab them extra attributes and Vanquish Soul names to the hand, it also acts as disruptions to like blow up everything in the column. And the way they sort of get Raisin back and special summon Raisin out onto the field is through Rock of the Vanquisher. So you do want to focus on them, stopping them from getting access to Raisin and stopping their like loop with Rock of the Vanquisher. So cards like DD Crow on the Vanquisher target can be good. Cards like Ash on cards like Stake Your Soul or Rhoda can be good to stop Raisin from even hitting the field in the first place. And then next up, one of the key monsters is Holy Sue. This is probably the best monster in the deck in the sense that it's a turn 0 interaction hand trap and engine like further extension from the deck. Something to watch out for is like they can turn 0 summon Raisin out into a column that you have monsters in and then blow it up. Plus search like follow up for the next turn. So if Holy Sue resolves, it can be really scary, which is why you want to use cards like Ash Blossom against Holy Sue to like prevent it from like snowballing all that advantage right away. And then finally, like the Vanquish Soul spells and traps are really good. Start, I think, is one of the best new cards in the deck. Being able to add a Vanquish Soul monster like once per turn, being able to like protect the Vanquish Soul monster once per turn, and then end phase being able to access Snow Devil just means this card does so much. I think you want to target down this card with cards like Ogre and even Vados if you choose to play that in your deck. And then finally, Snow Devil I think is like one of the most important cards in the deck. It's a very key part of their end board that gives them a very nasty interruption by like blowing up all the monsters on your field and then being able to like protect all their Vanquish Souls from card effects, which is like really annoying to deal with for a lot of decks. I think if this card gets to resolve against a lot of top decks, it can be devastating. So you really want to cut off cards like Vanquish Soul start from being able to set this card from the deck. In terms of hand traps that are good against Vanquish Soul, it also sort of feels like the hand traps just aren't great into Vanquish Soul. A lot of them are probably live, but the ones that really feel good are like only cards like Ash, I think, and like maybe Azuna and Impulse. These are the cards that I think like you really want to see against Vanquish Soul that feel pretty good. Even a card like Perulia, as crazy as it sounds, like I think it's only pretty solid against Vanquish Soul. I don't think it's something like you necessarily have to play, because I think the theory with Vanquish Soul is that they have the ability to play very well on both players' turns. They can use cards like Azuna on your turn, they can use cards like Holy Seal on your turn, and sort of do the same things that they would do on their first turn had they just gone uninterrupted. So in some sense, it almost feels like Purulia won't always be like a turn skip for them. In theory, like, they can just do the same thing on the next turn, which is also why I think a card like Droll is only a solid card against them. Obviously, Purulia and Droll, very, very high impact in the right situations, but Vanquish Soul does have that counterplay in the sense that they are able to just play on both turns really well. Ogre, like I mentioned, I think the main value Ogre gets in this matchup is being able to hit Start, but Start is such an important card that I think like Ogre warrants being in the solid tier. And then for all the other hand traps, Vanquish Soul is also a deck that can also play like super low to the ground, doesn't really need to commit to the extra deck that much. Once you start pairing with the K9 stuff, like maybe card like Fulos will be a little bit better on one hand, because like they will try to start comboing more, but on the other hand, like then you start playing into cards like Paradise Smasher, like I talked about in the K9 section. So in general, it kind of feels like hand traps are also like very hit or miss against Vanquish Soul, like the Vanquish Soul engine specifically, but I think there are still a few hand traps like Ash that you kind of have to play against this matchup, just to stop cards like Sue, stop access to cards like Raisin. Those interactions with Ash are just so important that I feel like you do have to risk like Ash playing into cards like K9 in this matchup, just because of how much it stops. And then for the last deck I want to talk about is Crystron. Like, I know there are still decks like Malice, Mitsuraiziel, other meta decks that are still relevant in this format, but I won't be talking about them in this video because I wanted this video to focus on like the Justice Hunter specific decks. If you want to see more details on how to beat like Malice or Raiziel, I recommend checking out my previous Where to Hand Trap guide. Like, that's already up on my channel for the Duelist Advanced format. I talk about a lot of the decks in there, and I feel like a lot of the Where to Hand Trap hasn't really changed for those decks, so do check that out if you are curious about that. But for the purposes of this video, this is going to be the last deck I'll talk about, being Crystron. They do get indirect support with like the K9 cards, and I think that really takes Crystron from being like a tier 2/rogue contender to almost being a tier 1 threat like everything else. The main card you want to stop is Sulfador. Sulfador allows them to dump 2 Crystron cards to the graveyard, and then those Crystron cards can like be a Monster Reborn, they can search cards. One Sulfador just does so much that I think you definitely want to use cards like Imperm to stop Sulfador. Speaking of the cards that they can send to the graveyard, Crystron Smiger is one of the key cards that they send, because this one adds a spell or trap, and the spells or traps are kind of like the scary part of the Crystron deck. I think you also want to focus on stopping Smiger's effect, because once they get access to Inclusion, Inclusion gets access to like something else, and then if Inclusion gets popped later on, it becomes like a Monster Reborn in the graveyard. So I think you actually want to stop them from getting access to like the spell card in the first place, even if you have like a card like Ash Blossom. Speaking of Inclusion, I think Inclusion's like definitely one of the best cards in the deck. Allows them to 1-card combo with a card like Sulfador, allows them to search any Crystron monster in the deck, and then also when it's in the graveyard it acts as a Monster Reborn, and you can do all that in a single turn. Cluster is also a very important part of their end board. Similar to Yummy, it gives them more layers onto their end board, to where a single card like Dark Ruler No More or Droplet won't necessarily devastate the entire board because they have access to Cluster. Cluster also gives them their grind game as well, being able to shuffle back key resources from the banish or graveyard to hit cards on the field. So I think like similar to Yummy, if you have board breakers like Dark Ruler No More, you want to consider stopping cards like Smiger from searching a card like Cluster, because the Cluster does give them that layered interruption. And I think the main Crystron like synchro monster you want to worry about is El Skeltis. This is sort of like the enabler for like a lot of their combos. It allows them to add back cards like Cluster from the graveyard that were dumped off Sulfador. It allows them to, whenever it gets popped off a card like Tristaros or a card like Sulfador, it's able to summon out a Crystron monster from the banish to the graveyard, and then allows them to keep comboing from there. So I think that you kind of want to stop your opponent from getting access to El Skeltis, because once they go Tristaros, summon El Skeltis, that Tristaros El Skeltis gets them like so many bodies and so many resources. So you want to cut them off from being able to access tuners like Tristaros from their deck. And yes, even though the Crystron monsters can, in theory, go into XYZ monsters, I feel like the synchro side of the Crystron deck specifically is definitely a lot scarier because of how much a single card like El Skeltis does. And then for hand traps that are good against Crystron, I think Crystron's a pretty resilient deck to hand traps overall, but there are a fair bit of hand traps that are still pretty solid against it. I think all the must-play ones are pretty self-explanatory, but cards like Fulos and Purulia, I think the fact that they have the ability to build like very solid half-boards even through these cards makes it so like I don't think these cards are necessarily auto-win against this deck. You probably do want to pair it with like other hand traps for them to stop them from getting access to cards like Cluster and bolstering their end board. Cards like Droll I think can also be okay, especially if they play the K9 engine. It does make it so they get a lot less value off of cards like Sulfador, but on the other hand, cards like Sulfador itself can also play through Droll alone, so it really depends when you hit them with Droll and what other cards are in their hand. Something important to note is like Lancia and Crow are good against this deck. Like you stopping cards like Smyger or Thisfern and stopping cards like Inclusion can be pretty solid. These are all very key parts of like the Crystron engine, and being able to stop them I think is pretty good overall. Outside of that though, I don't think there's anything like too interesting to talk about against this deck. This is a deck that like you want to focus your hand traps on Salvador, so cards like Impermanent Veiler are probably pretty solid. But if your opponent has like any way to keep like playing, even if Salvador doesn't resolve, they can still end on like fairly solid end boards, depending on like the rest of their hand. So in general, Crystron's also a deck that feels like it's fairly good into most hand traps, especially if they're pairing it with the K9 cards, which I assume every competitive Crystron build will be. So do keep that in mind when playing these hand traps against Crystron. While some of them, like the Charmies, and Droll can be pretty solid against the Crystron engine, you do want to watch out for the fact that like they do have access to K9 now, and the Crystron engine itself also has some ways around these hand traps inherently. Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comment section below. Do you agree or disagree with like some of the points that I made? Like, I'm curious to hear what you think. Overall, I feel like these decks are all generally like kind of hard to hand trap, but hand traps still feel like a necessary evil in the sense that like you can't really allow any of these decks to build a full end board uninterrupted, because it's just going to be so hard for board breakers to really deal with them unless you start seeing like 2 to 3 copies of them, which is why I still feel it's important to know which cards are important enough to hit in these decks, as well as which hand traps are good against them. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.